All right, so we'll kick it off with the macro. I suppose we'll save the best for last with Sarah. I'm just going to give, as Charles said, a brief overview of South Africa's macro situation over the past year and looking forward as we see it here at Telemer. So real GDP growth has rebounded quite strongly this year. But of course, the bulk of that is due to base effects. So we saw a historically large 6.4% contraction in 2020, and 2021 growth is expected to come in the low 5% handle. However, kind of zooming forward over the medium term, growth is expected to remain quite subdued. The forecasts I have on the left part of the slide here are from the IMF, but mesh quite closely with our view. Which is a slight rebound to around 2% over the medium term, and potential growth absent any major reforms staying in the kind of mid 1% area, which is roughly in line with population growth and means that incomes will remain flat in per capita terms. And another issue in South Africa, of course, is scarring from the pandemic has been quite severe. We've seen the unemployment rate tick up from already high levels of about 30% before the pandemic to about 35% currently. The IMF projects employment, if their growth forecasts play out, to continue rising towards 40% over the next 5 years. And that's for the overall labor force is much higher for youth, closer to the 60% area. So clearly generating growth is something that is quite urgently needed in South Africa. The good news is on the inflation front, there's been a lot of progress made in recent years, anchoring inflation towards the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's 3 to 6% target range. So inflation has picked up over the past few months, as it has elsewhere in other emerging markets. It ended the year at about 5.9%, which is above the SARB's 5.3% forecast from November. And this was driven primarily by rising fuel and food prices. Core inflation, while it's ticked up a little bit, is still at the bottom end of the SARB's target band. And inflation expectations, be they survey-based or market indicators like the break-even inflation rate, are actually relatively well anchored towards the middle of the Reserve Bank's target range, which is something that couldn't have been said 5 years ago when they were really much more firmly anchored towards the top. The real interest rate in South Africa, given this rise of inflation, has dropped quite a bit. It's now negative 2.2% using backward-looking inflation versus a neutral rate per the SARB's own estimates of about 2 to 2.5%. But I think this is a broadly appropriate stance given that the output gap is not expected to close until 2024. And inflation, despite the temporary rise in the past few months, is expected to moderate towards 4.5% by year end and stay in that range over the medium term. That said, given the upcoming Fed tightening in developed market monetary policy, and broader tightening across most of the emerging market universe, I think there is a clear need for the SARB to react proactively and avoid getting behind the curve on their monetary policy stance. They have a meeting tomorrow, of course, at which they're expected to hike rates by 25 basis points. Market expectations for the path of policy rates moving forward are actually quite hawkish and are pricing in 225 basis points of hikes over the next year. I think this is probably a bit too hawkish. This would imply rate hikes of over 25 basis points at each of the next 6 meetings this year. However, I think directionally it's broadly correct. I think the SARB is going to have to, especially early on in the year while inflation is still elevated, hike interest rates to avoid expectations becoming unanchored, which they've worked so hard to do in the past few years. However, if you're looking kind of at a broader emerging market view, while South Africa's inflation has ticked up in recent months, it's been less severe than the uptick we've seen in other emerging markets, where inflation has risen quite sharply over the past 12 months. EM central banks have responded by hiking on average by 100 basis points over the past year, or rather since mid-2020. We track about 66 emerging and frontier market central banks. Of those banks, 28 have hiked over the past year. This compares to only one 25 basis point hike in South Africa. So clearly a much less aggressive stance, but I think that's informed by a more moderate inflation trajectory. Moving to the fiscal accounts, obviously high commodity prices have been a major tailwind rather for South Africa over the past year, both from the fiscal and balance of payments perspective. There were massive commodity revenue windfalls, which led to a sharp contraction in their budget deficit. And this took place alongside a GDP rebasing, which led to 11% increase in nominal GDP. This is purely cosmetic, but it still led to a large improvement in the fiscal numbers. Now, the concern heading into the midterm budget review a couple months ago was that the revenue windfalls would be used simply to fund greater spending. However, in the event, about half of it was used to fund greater spending, largely on COVID-related stimulus measures. So I think a broadly appropriate response. And the other half was used to reduce the budget deficit. So compared to where we stood, say, a year ago or a year and a half ago, South Africa's fiscal trajectory is much more encouraging. But again, this is largely based on high commodity prices and a GDP rebasing, and something that I think cannot be taken for granted and needs to be followed through on in the years to come. Likewise, the debt trajectory is much more favorable. It's now projected to peak in 2025-26 at 78% of GDP. This is far less than the 95% peak in the 2020 midterm budget policy statement, again, largely due to rebasing. And if you compare this to their worst case scenario at the beginning of the pandemic, when they came out with the supplementary budget, debt over the medium term was viewed as potentially rising as high as 140% of GDP. So again, I think with standing where we are now compared to 12 to 18 months ago in a much more comfortable position, but still relative to most other emerging market peers, debt is still uncomfortably high, and fiscal space is quite limited. Looking at a breakdown of the budget, South Africa, given its low growth rate and relatively high interest rates, means there's a negative growth interest rate differential, which means that all else equal, debt will tend to increase over time, assuming they run a balanced primary deficit. That means that South Africa needs over time to move towards a primary surplus to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. And at the same time, debt servicing costs have increased quite aggressively in recent years. And this will increasingly crowd out pro-growth spending items like investment in physical and human capital, and of course is much stickier than discretionary spending items, which can be ramped up or down. This is really a permanent fixture of the budget and something that will make it very difficult to sustain fiscal consolidation over the longer term. Now, looking at the budget targets, again, they're looking to move towards a primary surplus by 2024-25, which would aid in stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio. But the big risk to spending on this front is the wage agreement. So last year we had a one-off, one-year temporary agreement, which led to about 1.2% of GDP of fiscal slippage. Now, if that's solidified moving forward, that's clearly going to weigh on the budget, weigh on the fiscal plans. And is something that is really up in the air at this point. I mean, wage negotiations are still ongoing, and I think labor unions are going to fight for above inflation increases as they've seen in recent years, which really is incompatible with the sustainable fiscal in South Africa. The other big risk is the basic income grant. We should get more details on this in the February budget. I think it's something that is, fair to argue that it's a necessary component of the social safety net in South Africa, but it's going to be quite costly and require a major reprioritization of spending away from other measures to keep debt on a sustainable path. Moving towards external accounts, South Africa achieved a record high current account surplus in 2021, about 3.8% of GDP. but this again was largely on the back of improving terms of trade due to high commodity prices. It's expected to swing back to a slight deficit this year and moderate towards a more normal range of about 2 to 3% over the medium term. And this, of course, will weigh on the rand in a way that it really hasn't over the past year. Another endemic issue in South Africa, of course, is weak performance of state-owned entities, Eskom being the major one. 2021 was a record year for load shedding and power cuts in South Africa, which you can see in the chart on the top left. However, there was the new reform announced in the middle of last year, allowing private investors to build plants with up to 100 megawatt capacity without a license. This was, I think, a major positive reform shift and represented, the first major shift in a positive direction in the sector in a long time. And, this will take time, of course, to pass through to new generation. So I think load shedding will be a feature of the economy in the years to come. But once this new capacity starts coming online, that can start to alleviate some of those constraints. And then the top right is Eskom's spread over sovereign. That started to widen out in recent months. I think continued delays to plans to unbundle Eskom into 3 different units and uncertainty over how debt will be divided up in that situation has caused some investor concern and is leading Eskom debt to sell off in recent months. I think the February budget will be another key milestone for more information on how the Treasury plans to deal with Eskom moving forward. But I think reform momentum at the entity at least is starting to gather for the first time in quite a long time. And then lastly, just looking at asset performance, South Africa's currency, the rand, has been an outperformer amongst its emerging market peers over the past year. Again, you can attribute this to high commodity prices. So not necessarily a vote of confidence in South Africa's longer term economic prospects, and something that could reverse quite quickly if we see terms of trade turn in the opposite direction. And then on the local government bond yield, South Africa, compared to other emerging markets, has one of the steepest yield curves. And I think this is due to the large risk premium that's been built into the longer end of the curve due to South Africa's poor fiscal and growth prospects. But also, I think we'll see this start to flatten in the coming months as the monetary policy tightening leads to increases at the shorter end of the curve. And as fiscal consolidation hopefully keeps the longer end anchored, we should see that differential between the long and short end of the curve start to come down. And then looking at hard currency debt, again, South Africa has been an outperformer over the past year. But you can see zooming out over the past 5 years has underperformed quite poorly. It used to trade at a premium to the MB index. Now it trades at a slight discount. And I think unless we see a major reform shift that boosts South Africa's longer term growth prospects and that aids in its efforts to bring down its debt ratios, then its underperformance over the longer term horizon will probably continue. And I think at this point, I'll hand it back to you, Charles. I'll be happy to address more questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much for taking over in an emergency there. If you can stop sharing your slides, then Sarah, if you can share yours.
Okay, can you see that, Charles?
Yeah, that's fine.
Wonderful. Okay, so sorry everybody for a very poorly timed toaster fire, I think it was in one of the kitchens. But yeah, I'm back, and we're going to be moving a little bit away from the economic now to look at some of the politics, and particularly I'm going to be talking about the 2021 local elections, so the local elections that just took place in early November of last year. So kind of the background to those, what happened and what some of the implications for that are. And then really looking ahead, the road to 2024, the next national elections, and kind of what we can expect to be happening in the political sphere and some of the implications of that for policy, for foreign policy, security, and the economy. So starting with the 2021 local election. So in terms of background, obviously hanging over everything at the moment is COVID-19. And that was certainly part of the background to these elections. So there were initially quite high levels of support and approval for the South African government's response to the pandemic. But by August of 2021, a survey suggested that 61% of South Africans strongly or somewhat disapproved of the way the government was handling the pandemic. And some of this is to do with sort of stuttering vaccine rollout. Some of this is to do with the real pressure that lockdowns and quite strict lockdowns put on people. And it's also kind of suggestions of corruption around COVID-19 and some of the contracts related to that. And the health minister was also put on special leave while an investigation against allegations of corruption was underway. So we've got a bit of a decline in support for the ANC government, the government in charge, in the run-up to these local elections. There was also extraordinary confusion over changing election dates. So the election was initially announced, these were local elections in 2021, they were initially announced to be taking place on the 27th of October. A number of parties then flagged the challenge of holding elections during a pandemic. And the South African Electoral Commission constituted an inquiry under the former Deputy Chief Justice to ascertain if the elections would be free and fair if they were held in October as planned. The inquiry took a little bit of time to come to its conclusions and eventually announced that there was a possibility that the elections might not be free and fair. So parties were sort of beginning to prepare for the elections. They were putting together candidate lists. They were beginning to think about mobilizing local citizens and residents. Then this sort of got put on hold. It looked quite likely, or at least possible, that the elections weren't going to be held at all. And the Electoral Commission applied to the Constitutional Court for the elections to be delayed, for them to be delayed beyond November 1st, which was the date they had to be held under the Constitution, or the latest date they could be held under the Constitution. They wanted to have this postponed to February, where it was generally felt that it would be more likely they would be free and fair. The Constitutional Court refused, and so in mid-September, the election date was officially set for November 1st. So parties had postponed their candidate list creation, they had postponed some of their mobilization and their advertising and all of this, and then suddenly everybody was flung into full election gear on a much shorter time frame than usual. This is also a context in which for many communities, large-scale mobilization events are a really important part of campaigning, things like rallies, big-scale rallies, and those were made much more difficult both by the changing election dates and by COVID-19 and some of the restrictions that existed around that. And then the kind of third key factor in the background to the local elections was violence. So between the 9th and the 18th of July, violence really swept, particularly the provinces of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And the violence was initially sparked by the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma for contempt of court. But it was fueled by all sorts of things and spread very, very widely. It was fueled by job layoffs, by economic equality worsened by COVID-19, frustration with service delivery, frustration with political parties, corruption. And the protests spread quite extensively and are or have been claimed to have been the worst violence that South Africa has experienced since the end of apartheid. So it was both quite shocking for a lot of people. It affected communities very heavily. It made it difficult for parties to mobilize in communities. It also affected supplies of food, of fuel, and of medicines. And a sort of second strand of the violence in the run-up to these local elections is violence that always happens in South Africa in the run-up to elections, but was particularly acute this time, which is violence around the candidate lists. This is particularly a problem within the ANC, where internal factionalism can make it quite difficult for local parties to decide who the candidates should be from different communities. It also affects other parties as well, but the ANC has a particular problem with it. And the violence on this occasion was so extreme that it led ANC leaders to beg ANC members, party members, branch leaders, and regional and provincial leaders in the papers to stop killing each other. And the candidate violence was made worse by sort of everything we've already discussed. The violence that had happened in July that had led to sort of increased grievances in some communities, the confusion over changing election dates, which meant that candidate lists were started and then put on hold and stopped and then started again. So this is kind of the background going into the elections. So local elections were held. They were held on the 1st of November, despite concerns from the Electoral Commission that they wouldn't be free or fair. There hasn't been a great deal of pushback since that date, suggesting that they weren't free and fair. Certain parties have claimed that they were disadvantaged, but they haven't been particularly challenged on kind of large-scale electoral grounds. Some of the key trends of these election results. So the first, and in some ways the most notable thing, was the significant decline in voter turnout. So there was about 46% of registered voters, which is about 30% of eligible voters actually voted in these elections. And that's versus approximately 58% in the last local elections in 2016. We know local elections tend to have lower turnout rates than national elections, but even compared to the last local elections, this is a very, very significant decline. There certainly is possibilities that some of this was to do with COVID and people not feeling safe going out or not being able to go out for various reasons. But there's also good evidence to suggest that it represents a deliberate stay away vote, people deliberately deciding not to vote. Now, the party most hit by this was the ANC. There's a lot of evidence from surveys that were done in the run-up to the elections and the immediate aftermath of the elections that suggest that a lot of ANC supporters who were really disgruntled with ANC governance and leadership decided, rather than voting for an opposition party, they didn't feel particularly that any of the available opposition parties stood up for what they wanted. They just stayed at home. Now, what does this mean going forward? Obviously, if we have levels this low in the national elections, it could lead to a crisis of legitimacy for the national government, a situation where the national government is effectively elected by a very small minority of the overall population. But again, there are good reasons to believe that we're not going to see such low turnout coming into the national elections, both because we know that local council elections tend to have lower turnout overall. This is particularly the case in South Africa, where local councils are routinely seen as the least trustworthy, the most corrupt, and the least competent part of government. So people tend to be less invested in them. And also, you know, the hope is that COVID also was a decline or a reason for this decline in turnout. A second major trend, and this has been a big psychological blow for the ruling party, is that ANC support fell below 50% for the first time since the ANC took power in 1994. So it dropped. Again, we know that ANC turnout is lower in local elections. We also know that the ANC underperforms in local elections by about 6% relative to national elections. But at the last local elections in 2016, the ANC gained about 54% of the vote, and they were down to 46% of the vote this time around. The loss was primarily in urban areas. Outside of urban areas, the ANC is still by far the party of choice. It does very well in rural South Africa, but South Africa's population is increasingly urban. It's about 60% urban, I think, at the moment, and it is urbanizing, right? So having a stable majority in rural areas isn't necessarily a huge benefit to the ANC if it wants to keep these large majorities it's enjoyed in the past. It's particularly galling for the ANC because the leadership promised to learn from municipal setbacks in 2016. The 2016 election results were also not seen as good for the ANC, 53.9. It was a little uncomfortably close to that 50% cutoff. And ANC leadership really, really wanted to see a strong showing here. In terms of what this means going forward, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Does it mean that we're necessarily going to see the ANC falling below 50% at the national elections in 2024? We'll get to that. But it's really important to note that this is a significant psychological blow for the ANC. However much the ANC has tried to spin this and say these are local elections and they're not national elections and COVID and all of these things, this is a significant psychological blow. And everybody I speak to within the ANC, from sort of branch leaders and individual members on the ground, right up to members of the leadership, are really concerned about this and concerned about what this is going to mean for the future of the ANC. So the ANC struggled in these local elections, but other major opposition parties also struggled. This wasn't a situation where ANC support declined and other major opposition parties gained some of that. So the Democratic Alliance, the biggest opposition party, also saw a decline in support. This was a smaller decline. It was from about 26.9% to 21.6%. But that makes it their worst local election since 2006. And the DA lost support on their right flank and to the Freedom Front Plus. And they also lost support, particularly in Gauteng, to a new outfit, Action South Africa, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, but which could prove a real problem for the DA going forward. Even in the Western Cape, which is the province that the DA governs, it's been their sort of flagship province, they lost majorities in many of the rural councils to the east. And here they mostly lost them to local interest and community parties. They weren't losing them to any of the other major parties. They were losing them to hyper-local organizations formed for these local elections. They did increase their majority in Midvaal. That's the only municipality they govern outright in Gauteng. And for the first time, they won a municipality in KwaZulu-Natal. So they had a little bit of something to kind of feel good about, but overall, it was their worst local election for some time. The next major opposition party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, they did grow their vote marginally. So they were at about 8.2% last time and about 10.3% this time. But that's well short of the goals that the EFF had set for themselves. And their support dropped in some really interesting places. So they did gain increased support in KwaZulu-Natal and in parts of the Eastern Cape. But in Polokwane, the hometown of their leader, Julius Malema, they lost quite significant support from nearly 30% to 23%. This is causing quite a lot of concern among EFF leadership. And they also lost support in other areas they had done well previously. And this is particularly in mining areas. Rustenburg was a big problem for them this time around. And Johannesburg and Tshwane, they also lost support. So although they are gaining some support, the areas that they've really heavily targeted, the hometown of their leader, mining areas, they've really tried to mobilize miners in the mining community, and big economic areas, they actually lost support in. And there's been some suggestion that a populist party like the Economic Freedom Fighters, although it believes and talks a lot about how it can gain 2/3 of the vote and really challenge the ANC, that it might actually have a sort of ceiling on how much it can grow, and that some of what we're seeing in this growth, but not significant growth, is the kind of existence of that ceiling, which various analysts have placed at about 15% based on the sort of policies that they hold and the groups of people within the country that those are likely to appeal to. And then the fourth key trend that we saw in these elections were increased support for some smaller parties and the rise of some new ones. So we had this significant decline in voter turnout. The major parties overall didn't do particularly well. And where some parties were able to pick up votes were actually these smaller or these newer parties. So the Freedom Front Plus had its best election yet. It won about 2% of the vote, right? So it's its best election yet, but this isn't a huge competitor in the opposition market. But it has done well enough to be in some governing coalitions and to be the biggest opposition in some municipalities. The IFP, which is predominantly a party that appeals to Zulu-speaking South Africans, has also shown that talk of its demise is premature, and it did quite well across KwaZulu-Natal. And parties based on coloured identity politics, coloured in the South African context, also did quite well, including the Patriotic Alliance and the Cape Coloured Congress. These parties, however, all have relatively small groups of people that they're appealing to. Freedom Front Plus is predominantly white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans. The IFP is predominantly Zulu-speaking South Africans, and the Patriotic Alliance and the Cape Coloured Congress are predominantly coloured South Africans. And this kind of limits, although they've done well in these local elections, on a national stage, looking ahead to 2024, it's unlikely any of them are going to emerge as major opposition parties. They're not appealing to a wide enough cross-section of South African society. So what about the new parties? There's been a lot of talk about how well some of these parties did, and they certainly did. So Action South Africa, this is a new party. It was a year old by the time we came to these elections, and it was formed by the former DA mayor, Herman Mashaba. So it's a DA defector from the Democratic Alliance. They only put forward candidates in 6 municipalities, but they received 2.4% of the overall national vote. And in the city of Johannesburg, the party came in 3rd overall with 16% of the national vote. This was a really impressive showing for a new party that was fielding candidates on a very small basis. One of the particularly interesting things about them is that they were expected primarily to draw votes away from the Democratic Alliance. That was where the majority of people expected their votes to come from, given the former links of Herman Mashaba. But actually, they seem to have drawn away more ANC supporters than both anybody expected, but also than DA supporters. And this suggests that Mashaba might be tapping into something that's been missing in South African politics, a pro-free market, party that doesn't have the racial baggage of the DA. So Action South Africa, I think, are going to be a really interesting party to watch going forward. But it's not clear at the moment that they're going to be able to keep their appeal and their coherence at the national level. So once they did quite well in these elections, there was a lot of confusion about what their approach was going to be to coalitions. We had leadership saying we won't form coalitions. We had leadership saying we will form coalitions. We won't form it with the ANC. We will form it with the ANC. And it suggested that part of the challenge of such a new party is they really hadn't yet developed the kind of policy platforms and the commanding leadership that we know are really important on the national stage, the sort of things that make people think, yeah, if I vote for you, I think you've got both a genuine chance of doing well, and if you do well, of being able to govern. And it's not clear yet whether they're going to be able to convince South Africans of that at the national level. There was also, and I've sort of mentioned this already, a rise of local interest and community parties. So these are often residents' associations, really locally focused, that formed to challenge existing candidates. Many were led by former disgruntled ANC activists and politicians, a few by ex-DA politicians. What this means for national elections is a little bit unclear. It's very unlikely these hyper-local community parties are going to stand at a national level. But it remains to see whether they will remain outside the fold and perhaps join something like Mmusi Maimani's One South Africa movement, which is attempting to bring together independent candidates from across the country for the national elections, or whether what they were doing in the local elections was signaling discontentment with local branches of their party, with local policy of their party, and that ultimately they'll actually be brought back into the fold, and you won't see these organizations standing in the national elections. So the immediate implications of the local elections for 2024. The low turnout, as I've said, this was extremely low. And if we see low turnout at the national election as well, it could create a crisis of legitimacy. But overall, I think we're likely to see somewhat higher turnout. I'm less worried about the 2024 elections sort of turning into a crisis of legitimacy for the South African government. The decline in ANC support, as I've mentioned, this will have been a huge, or it has been a huge psychological blow for the ANC. Whether the ANC is going to dip below 50% at the national elections, I don't think is clear. In general, they tend to underperform by about 6% at local elections. That would just push them above the 50% threshold if that holds. And I think there's a very reasonable chance it will. There's also a lot of evidence from survey data that while a lot of ANC supporters are unhappy with the ANC, actually very few of them see an existing opposition party as a legitimate alternative. And that really means that these existing opposition parties, if they want to dent ANC support at the national level, are going to have to do a much better job of really convincing the South African electorate that they are legitimate alternatives and that they will be better than the kind of devil you know, the ANC. Opposition parties, as I say, they're going to have to work hard. I think it's really unlikely that we're going to see any of the existing opposition parties able to kind of challenge the ANC and take, win over 50% and take outright control of the government. And I think the complexity around the hung councils and the coalitions we're seeing after these local elections, right? We've got this unprecedented number of hung councils and coalitions, and we've seen all sorts of infighting in these going on. And what that seems to be suggesting is that whilst a single opposition party is unlikely, I think, to be able to outright beat the ANC, it's also going to be really hard for opposition parties to work together and create any sort of coalition that could beat the ANC. These hung councils, these coalitions have and continued to be extremely contentious. And it's very hard to see how that's going to allow, if they're struggling to form coalitions at this level, it's very hard to see how opposition parties could form a convincing coalition at the national level. Okay, so moving a little bit further away from these local elections and thinking about the road to 2024. So what do I expect to see? Well, in politics, I think we will see some increased attention to rural issues. I don't think we're going to see a wholesale swing to rural, sort of a focus on rural policy, because, as already mentioned, the urban electorate is really important for the ANC. The rural electorate is relatively loyal to the ANC, and it's about 40% of the population. So they need to gain those urban voters. But they won't want to lose the rural voters they have in the run-up to 2024. So I think we are going to see some increased attention to them, and particularly increased focus on mobilizing them in the run-up to the national elections. I think we're unfortunately going to see a continuation of a trend we're already seeing, which is increasing chaos at the local government level. The local councils are really struggling to form coalitions. In a lot of places, we've got coalitions formed that are then challenged almost immediately by coalition members, or coalition members refusing to attend meetings, refusing to start meetings until water is provided in bottles rather than in jugs, all of this, right? There's just a lot of pushback, and really the evidence suggests that coalition partners, particularly the ANC and the EFF, are really just intended to be disruptive in a lot of these councils. I think we're going to see that continuing, and that has huge implications for things like service delivery rollout and local level policy formation. I think we're likely to see increased corruption and looting. Right, we've got increased factional infighting within the ANC. I think we're going to see the kind of Ramaphosa-led faction continuing to push for reform, right, and arguing that reform is the way to get the ANC back on track, the stamping out of corruption in order to continue governing the country. But some of the other factions, I think, are going to feel the writing is on the table for the ANC and perhaps for their faction within the ANC. And we know from evidence, both in the ANC and South Africa more broadly, but elsewhere around the world, that this kind of shrinking of time horizons, this sense that there's an end date, tends to lead to increased corruption and looting. All of this, I think, is going to lead to increased policy uncertainty. We're going to see a kind of back and forth as factional infighting pulls the ANC in one direction as another. I think the ANC is going to be very unwilling to come down definitively on positions that thinks might be unpopular, because they really do want to keep as many people in the fold as they can. And then we've got the question of challenges to President Ramaphosa's leadership. There's been a lot of talk about this. A weak showing at the local elections certainly opens the ground, but it's not obvious at the moment that there's a clear candidate who could take him on. And the polls have also repeatedly shown that Ramaphosa is actually very popular among the electorate, much more popular actually than the party as a whole. And they really can't afford to lose that. We have already had some people suggest they would be willing to challenge him. David Mabuza, the deputy president, is one. But in the past weeks, evidence of corruption and fraud have begun to stack up against him again, including the resurfacing of allegations of political murder. He's not going to be an easy candidate to get to the top slot. And I don't think there's anybody yet that really has the ability, the support within both the electorate and within the party to seriously challenge President Ramaphosa at the 55th National Conference of the ANC in December. In terms of foreign policy, I don't think we're going to see a huge substantive change in foreign policy, but I do think increased attention to domestic problems is likely to continue the trend of somewhat reduced activity abroad. This is not new in South African politics. We tend to find when the ANC is facing a crisis, it really focuses internally, and it focuses on domestic problems, and it does a little bit less of the diplomatic work abroad. Commercial engagement with Africa, this has been an increasing trend, and I think that's likely to continue. And I also think there's likely to be some increased focus on South-South relations. So South Africa has always maintained that it has a sort of twin goal, right? South-South relations and North-South relations. Within the South African Foreign Ministry, there's been a great deal of discontentment about the way that South Africa has been treated during the COVID-19 pandemic. The ease with which, when they've announced new variants that they've identified, borders have immediately been closed to them, and that this has caused huge problems for them in terms of trade, in terms of tourism. And there's some suggestion, therefore, that there's going to try and be an increased focus on building up some of these South-South relations to just ensure that the country is a little less affected if things like this continue to happen. In terms of security, we're likely to see increased political violence in the run-up to 2024. I think this is almost certain. And there's going to be sort of various flavors of this. There's going to be factional infighting within the ANC that has happened and I think will continue to happen. We're going to see fighting between parties. We're going to see increased protests. And I think the climate is ripe for violent displays of mass frustration and looting. And this is a combination of sort of everything that's going on: COVID, the factional infighting, the fighting between parties, the sense that there are no good options. All of these are likely to increase protests and displays of mass frustration. The economy, obviously, we've already heard from Patrick, and more is to come from Tanya. I'm not going to talk a great deal about it, but just to say, I think key political factors influencing the economy are political infighting and policy uncertainty, potential COVID-19 restrictions, these municipal coalitions, which are going to make local level policy decisions and service delivery really tricky, the potential for increased corruption, and the significant pressures that there are at the moment not only to continue the grant system, but actually to expand it, because the temporary COVID social relief of distress grant is due to expire. That's in March, and there's likely to be huge pressure to keep it. It's going to be very hard for the ANC, I think, to outright say no in the run-up to these elections. So the final sort of slide, what is a summary of all of this? I think the next couple of years politically are likely to be a period of increased political instability. Factional infighting, policy uncertainty, increased corruption, and unstable coalition governments. In the long run, I think the ANC's demise is inevitable. This is not something that's new post these 2021 local elections. This is something that I've been saying for a long time. It's something that a lot of analysts have been saying for a long time. But I think in 2024, they're going to continue to dominate South African politics. I think there are two scenarios. One is they win just over 50% and they rule outright. The other is that they win just under 50% and they're going to be able to dominate and form a ruling coalition with a single party, probably a small regional party that they can offer some roles to, but control to some extent. There's little evidence, as I said, that any of the existing opposition parties could win outright in 2024. And all of the infighting and disagreements around the municipal coalitions make it very unlikely we're going to see a coalition of major opposition parties unseat the ANC. So in the long run, an inevitable demise, but certainly into and beyond 2024, they are going to continue to dominate South African politics. Thank you. I will stop sharing now and hand back to Charles.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Right. 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 Tanya, over to you. You want to unmute? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Today I'm going to be taking you through some important legal considerations when doing business in South Africa, including recent legislative developments affecting South African businesses. Next slide, please. I will limit my focus to 4 areas, namely broad-based Black economic empowerment, antitrust competition, exchange control, and data protection. Next slide. Broad-based Black economic empowerment, or BEE, is a central part of the government's economic transformation strategy. Changes to the BEE laws have had a tremendous impact on all businesses operating in South Africa, including the ability of foreign investors to conduct businesses and conclude contracts and tenders in South Africa. Accordingly, foreign companies seeking to do business in South Africa, as well as local companies, will need to adapt to BEE policies. These policies aim to redress economic imbalances amongst historically disadvantaged communities to facilitate socio-economic transformation through granting procurement preferences on government contracts based on a company's level of BEE achievement. Procurement preferences and other benefits are based on a company's BEE certification level, which it receives through a scorecard assessing points based on equity, ownership, management control, skills development, and socio-economic development. We are finding that foreign companies often do well on the skills development and socio-economic development criteria. Equity ownership and management control may present greater challenges. A number of foreign companies have addressed the ownership element of BEE by forming employee share incentive schemes for BEE employees, thus economically empowering employees of the company without having to procure outside BEE shareholders. Not only are there certain ownership and control restrictions on foreign shareholders, but specific authorizations can also be required in certain regulated sectors, such as broadcasting, telecommunications, banking, insurance, and mining. Next slide, please. Charles?
Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. Under the amended BEE Act, It's an offence and penalty regime for persons found guilty of BEE fronting was introduced. A BEE commission was established. One of the functions of the commission is to oversee, supervise, and promote adherence with the BEE Act in the interest of the public. The commission is also responsible for investigating any BEE initiatives, either on a proactive basis or in response to a complaint. The Amendment Act also introduced reporting obligations for South African companies. One of the functions of the Commission is to maintain a register of major BEE transactions above a threshold determined by government. The BEE codes of good practice promulgated under the BEE Act were also amended to make the achievement of certain BEE scores and levels in terms of BEE scorecards more difficult for companies and other entities. The purpose of these amendments was to further promote and facilitate BEE in the South African economy. Next slide, please. Another legislative area which is noteworthy when conducting a business in South Africa is the Competitions Act. The Act regulates mergers having an effect in South Africa and prohibits agreements or practices between competitors that substantially prevent or lessen competition in a market. These include directly or indirectly fixing a purchase or selling price or any other trading condition, dividing markets by allocating customers, suppliers, territories, or specific types of goods or services, and collusive tendering. Next slide, please. The Competition Act also prohibits the abuse of dominance. A firm is considered to be dominant if it has a market share of 45% or greater. A firm with a market share of 35% or more is presumed dominant unless it can show an absence of market power. And a firm with a market share of less than 35% is considered dominant if it has market power. Market power is defined as the power of a firm to control prices or to exclude competition or to act in an appreciable extent independently of its competitors, customers, or suppliers. Next slide, please. It is prohibited for a dominant firm to charge an excessive price to the detriment of consumers, refuse to give a competitor access to an essential facility when it's economically feasible to do so, engage in an exclusionary act. So an exclusionary act is one that impedes or prevents a firm from entering into or expanding within the market. But this is only if the anti-competitive effect of the act outweighs the technological efficiency or other pro-competitive gains. And also a prohibition is to engage in price discrimination. With regards to mergers that have an effect in South Africa, if the merger exceeds certain combined assets and or turnover thresholds established by the Competition Act, the parties may not implement the transaction without first having obtained the approval of the competition authorities. Next slide, please. The Competition Amendment Act was signed into law on the 13th of February 2019, and its provisions will commence, some have already commenced, in a phased approach. Significant changes brought in by the amendments include buying power. There's a prohibition on dominant firms in designated sectors from imposing unfair prices or trading terms on small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, or enterprises owned by historically disadvantaged persons, which are commonly known as HDPs. Price discrimination, generally different pricing remains an infringement, but only if it substantively prevents or lessens competition. However, a different standard is applied if the differential pricing is to SMEs or HDPs. Such pricing will be an infringement if it impedes effective participation by SMEs and HDPs. With regards to mergers, additional considerations have been added in the assessment of whether a merger will substantively prevent or lessen competition. This includes the extent of common ownership and common directorship in competing firms and other mergers undertaken by the merging parties within a recent period. In addition, the Competition Commission and Competition Tribunal must consider the impact of SMEs and HDP firms and the promotion of a greater spirit of ownership. Foreign mergers and national security. The acquisition of South African businesses by a foreign acquiring firm can be blocked by a government committee if the merger may have an adverse effect on the national security interests of South Africa. Then market inquiries. This involves an expansion of the market inquiries provision and powers of the Commission in the context of market inquiries, including ability to make binding decisions arising out of market inquiries. There are additional factors of the Commission to consider when deciding what action to be taken pursuant to a market inquiry. In deciding whether any feature of a market impedes competition, the Commission must have regard to the impact of the adverse effect on competitions, on SMEs and HDPs. And then finally, penalties. The maximum penalty for repeat offenders has increased from 10% to 25% of a firm's annual turnover in the Republic and its exports from the Republic during the firm's preceding financial year. In addition, the tribunal can impose the penalty on controlling firms if they had knowledge of the prohibited conduct. All prohibited practices are now subject to a penalty for a contravention. Next slide, please. With regards to exchange control, South Africa has a strict regime which limits the extent to which South African residents and companies may transfer funds abroad. Such foreign investments and the repatriation of funds are regulated and require the approval of the South African Reserve Bank. SARB has delegated much of its power and authority to authorized dealers, which are essentially banks and other institutions licensed to undertake exchange control functions and grant approvals under exchange control. The exchange control authorities have a wide discretion that is exercised in accordance with the exchange control regulations and the exchange control rulings in line with the policy guidelines laid down by the Minister of Finance. All applications for exchange control must be made through an authorized dealer. The exchange control system has been gradually liberalized over the past few years in South Africa, and it's a stated intention of the National Treasury that this gradual deregulation of exchange control will continue. Most, but not all, of the exchange control policies and regulations are focused on the exchange control transactions of South African residents. So that is inward transactions. Sorry, outward transactions. Next slide, please.
It's not.
Okay, I'll just carry on without the slides. Oh, there we go. There we go. The recently enacted Protection of Personal Information Act of 2013, or POPIA, is a legislative initiative aimed at giving effect to the constitutional right to privacy by safeguarding personal information when processed by responsible parties. The Act has far-reaching consequences and affects all businesses in South Africa. POPI sets out various provisions that regulate the manner that personal information can be processed by both natural and juristic persons, including employers. So personal information in terms of POPIA is information that relates to an identifiable living natural person and, where applicable, an identifiable existing juristic person, for example, companies or trusts, and includes but is not limited to information on race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, national, ethnic or social origin, etc. Also information on the educational, medical, financial, criminal, employment history of a person. In addition to this, any identifying number, for example, ID numbers, registration numbers, symbols, emailing address, physical addresses, telephone numbers, and location information. And quite significantly, correspondence sent by the person that is implicitly or explicitly of a private or confidential nature. So, it's quite a wide net, the definition of personal information. Then a responsible party, as defined in the Act, holding personal information must ensure compliance with all the conditions for the lawful processing of personal information under POPIA. What we've seen in recent months is businesses having undertaken data assessments and introduced data retention policies and plans in order to comply with POPIA. Next slide, please. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I think back to you, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we will now have a Q&A session, and let's see what we have in the way of questions. Okay, right, Sarah, there's a question here from Tanya's colleague in London, Craig. He says, what's your view of Sisulu as a potential challenger to Ramaphosa? She's making waves and seems to be positioning herself. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, so I did just throw something very quickly into the chat, but just to kind of expand on that, I think she's certainly trying to position herself. I think she has, directly challenged Ramaphosa in a very public arena, and I think this is the beginning of a kind of campaign to set herself up as a candidate against Ramaphosa. She has for a long time been closely allied with the Zuma camp, and I think she is likely to look to rally people who are still part of the pro-Zuma camp, people who are going to be particularly affected perhaps by some of the reports coming out around corruption. As I said, she's struggled in the past to challenge Ramaphosa, as I said in the chat. So she had a failed bid against Ramaphosa in 2017. And it's not at all clear to me that the factional balance in the ANC has shifted in a way that benefits her. So I think she is gearing up to make a challenge. At present, there's some evidence she's been trying to rally support, particularly among the Women's League. But most of the provincial leaders have so far indicated that they plan to endorse Ramaphosa, and she doesn't seem to be rallying a really powerful and significant group of people within the ANC.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to wrap up in a minute. Do you have any final comments on anything else, Sarah?
No, I think that's everything from me.
Okay, Patrick, do you have anything specific?
Nothing for me, Charles. Thanks.
All right. And Tanya, do you want to say anything else or about the business environment at the moment?
Nothing from me unless there's any question.
All right. There's no specific ones, I think, at the moment. So I think we'll leave it at that. As I said, we'll prepare the podcast, hopefully in the right order, and we'll be sending you a link, everyone a link tomorrow. So thank you again. Apologies for the problems at the beginning, and as we said, our next one will be on the 16th of February on the Arctic. So many thanks to everyone. Have a good day. All right, bye.